The slap echoed through the first-class cabin. It was a sound that felt out of place, like a sudden thunderstorm in the middle of a clear, calm sky. The passengers froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Eyes darted toward the front of the cabin, where seat 1A, usually just another quiet corner of the plane, was now the center of an unexpected spectacle. A tall, stern-faced flight attendant stood there, her hands still suspended in the air, her expression twisted in disbelief. Her heart hammered in her chest, unsure of what had just happened, but certain it was something monumental. Leonard sat in his seat, blinking in stunned silence. His expression was unreadable, yet there was a shift in his eyes, a quiet confidence, a knowing calm that only intensified the tension in the air. Denise had made a mistake, and it wasn't just any mistake. It was a colossal error. She had thought she was putting a demanding, entitled passenger in his place. Maybe he was a businessman who had gotten a free upgrade, or some celebrity who thought rules didn't apply to him. But what Denise didn't know, what no one in the cabin knew, was that the man she had just slapped, Leonard Foster, was the owner of the airline. The entire airline, the one they were flying on, the one that employed her. And in the next few moments, her life was about to change forever. For 10 years, Denise had worked as a flight attendant, cruising between cities and serving the world's wealthiest and most powerful people. She knew the type. She could tell who belonged in first class and who didn't. The entitled millionaires, the over-the-top businessmen with their shiny shoes and louder-than-life personalities, the ones who made it clear they were in charge. Leonard wasn't one of them. He wasn't checking emails or loudly talking stocks. He wasn't trying to make the biggest deal on the flight. He just sat there, flipping through a magazine, calm, composed, almost as if he didn't care about the luxury around him. And that's what unsettled her. People like him shouldn't be so normal, so nonchalant. She noticed him the moment he boarded. Something about his quiet demeanor didn't sit right. He wasn't brash, wasn't demanding. Maybe it was the stillness in his posture, the way he didn't need to show off or prove his worth. First-class passengers always made it clear they belonged. But Leonard? He didn't fit the mold. He was too subtle. That nagging feeling had only grown stronger throughout the flight. So after Denise had passed him twice and watched him, she finally decided to act on her gut. She approached him, asking the question she thought would confirm her suspicions. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" she asked, the words sharp, a little too pointed. Leonard didn't flinch. He didn't look up immediately. He simply met her gaze when he did, his expression calm, his brown eyes steady. "Yes," he replied, pulling out his boarding pass without a word. Denise took it, checked the name, Leonard Foster, verified the seat. Everything was correct. Still, her instincts didn't let up. Something didn't add up. She knew what she was feeling wasn't just paranoia. There was something else going on here. She gave him his boarding pass back, but before she could walk away, she turned back, compelled to push further. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was obsession. She had to know. "Do you mind showing me your ID?" she asked, her voice tight. Leonard didn't hesitate. He slid his wallet from his pocket, pulled out his ID, and handed it to her without a second thought. Denise scanned it quickly. The name matched the boarding pass. The photo matched the man sitting in front of her. But something still wasn't right. She lingered, staring at the ID a bit too long. Her heart raced as the whispers in the cabin began to fade. The reality of what had just happened, the slap, the challenge, the exchange, started to hit her. She handed the ID back. Her throat went dry. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice clipped, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Leonard simply nodded, returning to his magazine as if nothing had happened. And for a moment, Denise thought that maybe, just maybe, she was overthinking everything. But deep down she knew, this wasn't over. Denise couldn't shake the feeling. It gnawed at her through the remainder of the flight, the sense that something was off, something deeper than a simple mistake or misunderstanding. She tried to focus on her duties, moving through the cabin, making small talk with passengers. But her mind kept drifting back to seat 1A Leonard. She glanced at him now and then as she passed, his stillness unsettling. He didn't look like the type of guy who would let a little thing like a flight attendant's challenge rattle him. He barely seemed to notice what had just happened. But Denise knew better. People like him didn't just let things go, not easily. The other passengers in first class were beginning to stir. Whispers spread through the cabin. Some passengers who had noticed the exchange were now eyeing Leonard curiously. A few exchanged glances, perhaps wondering if they had witnessed something bigger than a simple misunderstanding. She couldn't blame them. After all, she wasn't the only one who felt that something wasn't quite right. Denise couldn't let it go. Every time she passed Leonard's seat, she stole a quick look. Was he making a call? Looking at his phone? Doing something that could explain his unusual composure? But no, he was still sitting there, flipping through his magazine, sipping his water, completely unaffected by her actions. It wasn't normal. Nothing about this situation was normal. Frustrated, she finally stopped by the galley where Carla was preparing drinks. Denise leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Something's not right with that guy in 1A, she muttered. Carla didn't look up immediately. She was used to Denise's suspicions about passengers. "What do you mean?" she asked, glancing over with mild interest. Denise shook her head, frustration creeping into her voice. "I don't know. It's just a feeling. He doesn't act like the usual first-class passengers. There's something weird about him." Carla raised an eyebrow, then shrugged. "He's in the right seat, though, isn't he?" Denise nodded, albeit reluctantly. "Yeah, but—" She hesitated, not quite able to explain the unease she felt. "There's just something about the way he looks at me, like he knows something I don't." Carla didn't respond right away, her gaze lingering on Denise. "You're imagining things. Maybe he's just calm. Not everyone's got to put on a show like some of these other guys." Denise wasn't convinced. "I don't know. I'm going to figure it out." "Denise, you've checked his ticket. You've seen his ID. What more do you need?" Carla asked, her voice now tinged with a little impatience. Denise ignored her, grabbing the phone from the galley wall. She punched in the number for the ground crew, dialing the number that could either confirm her suspicions or put them to rest. The line clicked, and she asked for confirmation on Leonard's details. There was a pause on the other end before the response came back. "All clear. Leonard Foster, seat 1A. Everything checks out." Denise swallowed hard. Everything checks out, but it didn't feel like everything was in order. She stared at the phone for a moment, weighing her options. There was only one thing left to do: watch him closely for the rest of the flight. If he didn't belong here, she'd catch it. If he did, well, she'd still find a way to justify her doubts. She took a slow breath, smoothing her uniform as she moved toward the front of the plane again. The truth was, she wasn't entirely sure what she was hoping for. But there was no way she could let this go, not now. As the flight continued, Denise couldn't stop herself from casting furtive glances toward Leonard. He was still sitting in seat 1A, as calm and composed as he had been when she first approached him. There was nothing extraordinary about him now, just a man in a crisp shirt, flipping through a magazine, seemingly lost in thought. Yet the longer Denise watched him, the more convinced she became that there was something she was missing, something important. She wasn't a rookie. She had worked long enough to know when something felt off, when the pieces didn't fit. And right now, the pieces were scattered all over the place. Her instincts were telling her one thing, but the facts told her another. The ticket was legitimate. The ID matched. The manifest listed Leonard as a first-class passenger. Everything was in order, yet her gut told her there was something wrong. It didn't help that every time she walked by, passengers were whispering. Some looked back and forth between Denise and Leonard, their eyes wide with curiosity, while others pretended to mind their own business, but couldn't hide the subtle glances. It wasn't just the other passengers who were beginning to notice. Denise could feel Carla's gaze on her from the galley as well. The younger flight attendant had always been skeptical of Denise's hunches, but today, something was different. Carla was watching her more closely, and it made Denise uncomfortable. She made her way through the cabin again, pausing near seat 1A for a moment too long. Leonard didn't even look up this time. He didn't acknowledge her at all. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. It was like he was giving her the space to make up her mind, to decide whether she was going to pursue this or let it slide. Denise didn't want to admit it, but she was beginning to wonder if she had made a mistake. Maybe Leonard was just a quiet, reserved businessman who didn't care about the usual first-class theatrics. Maybe she was the one who had overreacted. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that there was one thing she couldn't ignore: that feeling in the pit of her stomach. Denise turned back to the galley, trying to steady her nerves. She picked up a tray and began to prepare drinks for the other passengers. Carla was busy organizing the remaining beverages, her eyes occasionally flicking up toward the front of the plane, where Denise could feel the weight of her judgment. "Denise?" Carla called softly, but there was something different in her tone this time, something more serious. "What exactly do you think you're going to find?" Denise hesitated, her hands tightening around the tray. "I don't know. But I need to know I'm not just imagining this. Carla frowned but didn't say anything else. Instead, she kept her focus on the task at hand, but Denise could feel her gaze lingering. The next time Denise passed Leonard's seat, she made sure to take a longer look. This time, she didn't stop. She kept walking, but her eyes remained locked on him, watching his every movement. He was still completely unfazed, flipping through the pages of his magazine with the same calm demeanor. Then it happened. Just as Denise was about to pass, Leonard lowered the magazine and met her gaze for the first time since their earlier exchange. His eyes locked with hers, and for the briefest moment, something shifted in the air. A chill ran down her spine. It wasn't a threatening look. It wasn't even angry. It was something more unsettling, a quiet, knowing look that said he was aware of her every move, aware of every doubt she had. She felt the tension in her chest tighten. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. It was as if he was daring her to ask the question she hadn't yet asked. Who are you really? Denise turned away quickly, her pulse racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer just about a simple mistake. This was about something bigger. But what? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep moving forward, pretending everything was fine. But the reality was clear. She had no idea who this man was, and she was about to find out. The rest of the flight passed in a blur for Denise. Every time she moved through the cabin, her eyes darted toward Leonard, and each time, he remained seated, unfazed, his eyes occasionally glancing up but never acknowledging her directly again. It was as if he was waiting, letting her come to him on her own terms. She couldn't understand it. The other passengers were still whispering, some of them likely sensing the growing tension, while others kept their heads down, pretending not to notice the strange atmosphere around seat 1A. Denise tried to focus on her duties, but it felt like she was walking through a fog. She kept replaying the moment when Leonard had locked eyes with her, that silent challenge in his gaze. Something about it felt like a warning, but she couldn't place why. When she passed by again, Carla caught her eye. There was a shift in her expression, one that said she'd noticed how distracted Denise had become. It wasn't that Carla didn't believe in gut feelings, but her professionalism often got the best of her. She wasn't one to jump to conclusions. "Denise," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you've checked everything. There's no mistake with the ticket. Maybe you should let it go." But Denise couldn't. She knew something wasn't right, and if she backed down now, she would never be able to trust her instincts again. She had to prove that she wasn't just imagining things. There was too much at stake. She approached the flight attendant phone once more, her fingers trembling as she punched in the number for ground control. The line clicked, and she asked for confirmation on Leonard's details again. Her voice was steadier than she felt. A brief pause followed. "We've already confirmed his details, Denise. Leonard Foster, seat 1A, all checks clear." The voice on the other end confirmed. But this time, something in their tone was different, almost dismissive. Denise's stomach sank, but she couldn't stop herself. "Can you double-check his profile, maybe a background check? Is there anything unusual?" She wasn't sure why she was asking, but her mind raced. The response came quickly. "No, miss, there's nothing irregular with his status." Frustrated, Denise hung up the phone. She stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of her decision. She had to confront him, but she had no idea how to navigate this strange, mounting tension between them. Still, she couldn't let this go. Carla was watching her from the galley again, this time a more knowing look in her eyes. "Denise, what are you hoping to prove here?" Carla asked, her voice soft yet full of unspoken concern. Denise didn't answer right away. She felt like she was standing at a precipice. The question was simple. Was Leonard just a regular businessman in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was he something else entirely? It didn't matter anymore. She needed to find out. Denise moved toward the front of the cabin again, trying to shake off the mounting pressure in her chest. She couldn't explain why she felt so compelled to continue, but the nagging feeling that something was off wouldn't let her go. The hum of the plane, the soft murmurs of the other passengers, the click of seatbelts being fastened, everything felt muted. Her thoughts were consumed with Leonard. She passed by his seat once more, but this time, instead of walking past quickly, she slowed her pace. The urge to confront him had built up in her since the first glance, and now it was unavoidable. The uncertainty, the tension, had reached its breaking point. She needed to know if she was right or if she had completely misread the situation. But as she walked, her heart hammered in her chest. What if she was wrong? What if Leonard was exactly who he said he was, and her doubts had been nothing more than paranoia? Would she look foolish? She stopped beside his seat, taking a deep breath. Leonard didn't look up at her. He seemed perfectly content, engrossed in his magazine, oblivious to the storm brewing in her mind. The calmness in his demeanor was unsettling. She had been trying so hard to make sense of him, but the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like he was just playing a game with her. A game she wasn't sure she could win. Her voice was a little tighter than she intended when she spoke. "Sir, can you tell me again, are you traveling alone?" Leonard lowered the magazine slowly, his gaze meeting hers with that same unblinking stare. His eyes were calm, almost too calm, and his expression was unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, just observed her with a patience that made her skin prickle. The seconds dragged on, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. It was like the whole cabin had gone silent, even though the sounds of the flight still buzzed around her. "Yes," he said at last, his voice smooth, giving nothing away. "I'm alone." Denise didn't know what to say. She had expected something more, a slip, a hesitation, maybe even a hint of annoyance, but no. Leonard's response was cool, composed. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't worried. It was as if he had anticipated the question all along. She had seen it before, in high-profile businessmen, the kind of calm confidence that came with wealth and power. But something about this situation didn't sit right. She couldn't just let it go. "So," she pressed, her voice a little firmer now, "your seat wasn't upgraded?" Leonard didn't respond right away, but his eyes flickered slightly. It was the only sign of movement, and for some reason that small shift in his gaze made Denise's heart skip a beat. "No, it wasn't," he replied, his voice almost too composed, too careful. "I purchased this ticket." There it was, the confirmation. His ticket was legitimate, his ID matched, and everything was in order. Yet, Denise felt like she was still standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to take the leap or pull back. She placed her hands on her hips, trying to steady herself. She was starting to feel like she was chasing a ghost, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. "You don't mind if I double-check your ID, do you?" Denise asked, trying to sound casual, even though her voice was tight with the weight of her own doubt. Leonard didn't seem to flinch at the request. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, opening it with careful precision. He handed over the ID without a word. She took it, scanning the details. Leonard Foster, the name on the ticket. Everything checked out. There was no discrepancy, no mistake. And yet her mind screamed at her to keep going, to push further. She handed the ID back without saying anything. Her mind was racing, but her mouth had gone dry. Was this the moment she had been waiting for? Or was it just her overactive imagination playing tricks? Leonard took the ID back, his expression unchanged. He didn't look at her with anger or irritation. He simply returned to his magazine as though nothing had happened. Denise turned on her heel, walking briskly back to the galley. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. Maybe, just maybe, she had misjudged everything. Her hands shook slightly as she busied herself with the drinks, trying to compose herself. The silence from Leonard, the calm, had unsettled her more than any outburst or confrontation ever could, and deep down, she knew it wasn't over. As the flight progressed, Denise couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. Her nerves were on edge. Every step she took down the aisle was deliberate, as though she were walking through a minefield. She stole glances at Leonard, trying to discern anything that might give her a clue, but he remained unbothered, as if the entire situation was of no consequence to him. The way he sat, so composed, so effortlessly in control, only added to the unease that had settled deep in her gut. It had been over an hour since their last interaction, and the more she thought about it, the more Denise realized how wrong she'd been to confront him in the first place. What if Leonard wasn't just a regular businessman who got lucky? What if, despite his quiet demeanor, he was exactly who he said he was? What if he really was the owner of this entire airline? The thought gnawed at her, and she felt like she was walking a tightrope between doubt and suspicion. The passengers were beginning to settle into their routines, some with closed eyes, others tapping away on their phones, while Denise's mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Why had he let her question him like that without reacting? Why hadn't he just shut her down immediately? Maybe he had already anticipated this moment, knowing it was only a matter of time before someone would notice him. She caught herself glancing at his seat again, her eyes narrowing instinctively. But this time, something was different. The look on his face had changed. He wasn't reading his magazine anymore. His eyes met hers across the cabin, and for a split second she felt that old, unsettling tension rise between them. There was no malice in his gaze, no anger, but it was enough to make her pause. Leonard didn't say anything, didn't gesture for her to come closer. But somehow, without saying a word, he had made her feel like an intruder. Her own sense of guilt and unease overwhelmed her for the first time. She stood there, caught between two worlds, the world she had known as a flight attendant, following protocol, and the world she had just stepped into, one where her instincts, her doubts, were leading her toward something far more complicated than she was prepared for. As she walked past his seat again, she thought she saw a brief flicker of a smile, but it was gone in an instant, as though he had never moved at all. Was he enjoying this? Was he watching her struggle with her own conscience? Denise didn't know, but one thing was clear. She had underestimated him. She had assumed that a man who looked so ordinary, so inconspicuous, could not possibly be the man who owned the airline she worked for. And yet, now all she could do was wonder how much more she had misjudged. The rest of the flight went by in a blur. The crew went through their motions, the passengers settled into their routines, and Denise continued to try and shake the feeling that she had already crossed a line she couldn't uncross. But it was too late to turn back now. The questions she had about Leonard would only continue to haunt her until she found the answers. But would she ever be ready to face the truth? The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the descent. Most of the passengers were settling in for the final stretch of the flight, some dozing off, others simply staring out the windows. But Denise could feel the tension in her chest growing with each passing minute. She couldn't stop thinking about Leonard. There was something in the way he carried himself that made her doubt everything she had ever known about her job. The rest of the crew seemed oblivious, moving through their routines as usual. Carla, her colleague, was folding blankets and offering last-minute drinks, oblivious to the storm that raged inside Denise. They had both worked enough flights to know when something was off, but Carla's attitude toward Leonard had been dismissive from the start. She didn't get why Denise was still so hung up on it. But Denise wasn't about to let this go. Something in her gut told her that this was bigger than she realized. She stole another glance at Leonard's seat. He was still there, calm, relaxed, completely unbothered. A few other passengers were beginning to whisper quietly, as if the tension was slowly creeping into the atmosphere. But Leonard remained the picture of composure. It was almost maddening. How could he be so certain of himself, so confident? Denise turned away, but the unease lingered. The whole situation was starting to feel like a game, and she wasn't sure if she was the one being played or if she was playing herself. If Leonard really was who he claimed to be, if he truly owned the airline, then she had just made a terrible mistake. But if he wasn't, then what did that mean for the flight crew's role in making sure everything ran smoothly? She made her way back to the galley, her mind spinning. There was one last thing she could try. She pulled out her phone and dialed the ground crew, knowing that they had access to more information than she could ever get on her own. When the line clicked open, she hesitated, then asked, "Can you confirm something for me? Leonard Foster, the passenger in 1A. His details. Are they legitimate?" The silence on the other end felt like an eternity. Then the voice replied, flat and professional. "Yes, ma'am. Leonard Foster, chairman and majority stakeholder of Atlantic Global Airways. Owner. His information is all correct." Denise felt her stomach drop. All this time she had been right. He had been who he said he was, but instead of feeling relief, she felt a sharp pang of shame. She had misjudged him, and worse, she had treated him like some imposter. But the worst part wasn't realizing the truth. It was understanding that Leonard had known exactly what she was doing the whole time, and had let her do it. Denise stood at the galley door, feeling the weight of the truth settle into her chest. The phone call had confirmed everything she had suspected, but what did it change? She had been wrong about Leonard from the start, and now there was no going back. No way to undo the awkwardness, the tension, the way she had questioned him so openly in front of everyone. But even worse, she had treated him like someone who didn't belong. And yet, here he was, the very man who owned the airline, the same one she had doubted. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the galley counter as she fought to calm her breathing. She glanced back toward the first-class cabin, trying to avoid meeting Leonard's gaze again. But no matter how much she tried to avoid him, she couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was everywhere. Every corner of the plane, Every seat, it all seemed to whisper his name. Leonard Foster. The flight had now reached its final descent, and soon they would land. She knew she had to face him, to apologize for what had happened, but a part of her hesitated. What could she possibly say to make things right? What was there left to salvage after all of this? She felt the hand of Carla on her shoulder, a small, reassuring touch. Carla had been watching her closely, noticing the tension that had settled in her posture. "You okay?" Carla asked, her voice gentle. Denise nodded, swallowing her nerves. I need to talk to him." Carla didn't press her further but gave a small nod, her eyes scanning the cabin for a moment before she focused back on Denise. She didn't understand it fully, but she knew her friend had been struggling with something deeper than just a simple passenger mistake. Denise took one last breath before she turned toward the first-class section. She walked slowly, with purpose, trying to steady her hands as she approached Leonard's seat. As she neared him, she saw that he was still scrolling through his phone, his expression unchanged. But something about his stillness now felt different. There was a calm finality to it. When he looked up at her, it wasn't with the anger or frustration she had expected. It wasn't even a look of disappointment. Instead, there was something else in his eyes, something almost understanding. "I know," he said quietly, breaking the silence before she could say anything. Denise froze. The weight of the words hit her harder than she expected. "You know?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Leonard nodded, his gaze unwavering. "You've been trying to figure me out since you saw me. You were suspicious. You had your doubts. But you've learned the truth now, and I respect that." For a moment, Denise couldn't speak. She had expected a confrontation, a dismissal, even an apology from herself. But this was something entirely different. "I'm sorry," she managed to say finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean to treat you like that. I was wrong." Leonard's lips curved into the slightest of smiles, almost imperceptible. "You weren't wrong, you were just doing your job, and that's something I can appreciate." Denise blinked, taken aback. That was not the response she had anticipated. She had expected the worst, but instead, Leonard's calm, measured words only added to her confusion. "Are you upset?" she asked, the question leaving her mouth before she could stop it. Leonard shook his head. "Not at all. I've been in your shoes. I know what it's like to feel like you don't belong, but sometimes it's not about fitting in. It's about knowing when to stand your ground." Denise was left speechless. The world around her seemed to blur for a moment as she processed his words. Leonard Foster wasn't just a businessman. He was a person who understood more than she had given him credit for. And in that moment, she realized something profound. He had forgiven her, not because he had to, but because he saw her for what she truly was. A professional who had been thrown off balance by an unexpected truth. She took a deep breath, her heart still racing, but now with a sense of relief. She had expected the worst, but Leonard had offered her something far more valuable, understanding, and that was something she could never forget. As she turned away to finish her duties, she felt lighter, as though the weight of her earlier mistake had been lifted, not through punishment, but through the simple act of seeing things from a different perspective. And as the plane touched down, Denise knew that this experience, however uncomfortable it had been, had changed her forever.